You ever wonder why we love talking about other people? I mean, not just talking, obsessing. Whether it's celebrity drama, office rumors, or some random story online, we're drawn to gossip like moths to a flame. But what if I told you that gossip, the thing we brush off as harmless, has actually shaped history, built empires, ruined lives, and what if the stories we whispered in corners have always had a much louder impact than we ever realized? In this episode of True Crime Echoes, we're not just talking about secrets, we're diving into the dark history of gossip, from royal courts and Hollywood studios to the digital mobs of today. This isn't about tea, this is about power, and what happens when a whisper becomes a weapon. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Fire Beneath the Whispers. You know, Aber, I've always been fascinated by the quiet power of a whisper. Like how something so small, so effortless, can burn entire reputations to the ground. And if you think gossip is just harmless chatter passed over coffee or through the glow of a phone screen, well, history has a different story to tell. In 1590, in the chilly hills of North Berwick, Scotland, a woman named Agnes Sampson was dragged before a tribunal accused of consorting with the devil. But when you peel back the hysteria, what sparked the accusation wasn't some dark ritual in the woods. It was something much simpler, much quieter. It was gossip, whispers in the town square, a neighbor repeating a story heard from a friend of a friend, and that was enough to light the match. Agnes was tortured, shaved bald, and eventually burned alive, all because someone talked. When I first learned about this, I couldn't stop thinking how many lives have been destroyed not by proof, but by perception. Gossip, when weaponized, is dangerous. And the thing is, we're all kind of drawn to it, aren't we? It's the forbidden fruit of conversation, sweet tempting, and a little bit toxic. And it's been with us for a long time, like longer than you'd think long. Way before TMZ, before tabloids, even before newspapers. We're talking stone tablets kind of long. Today, we'll take a look at the real story behind gossip, not the celebrity fluff, but the dark, twisty roots that run through history. This isn't just about who wore what or who slept with who. It's about control, power, shame, and reputation. It's about how rumors have been used to enforce social norms, humiliate enemies, and sometimes spark revolutions. We'll meet the man who turned gossip into a literal business model, extorting the rich with secrets. We'll explore how Hollywood's golden age was built as much on scandal as it was on cinema. And yes, we'll see how two women waged a cold war with their pens, shaping the fates of actors, politicians, and each other. But before all that, I want to go back to where it all began. Not in Beverly Hills, or on the front page of a tabloid, but in the dust of Mesopotamia, where the first written language was carved into clay not to record the laws of kings, but to tell a salacious little story about a married woman, a local official, and a secret affair. Yeah. One of the oldest written records ever found, it was gossip. So no gossip isn't new, but what it does to people and what people will do to control it. That's where the story gets dark. Let's go back, way back, to the very beginning. Chapter 2. Gossip Carved in Stone. So here's the wild part. When I said gossip has been around since the beginning, I wasn't exaggerating. Let's rewind all the way back to Mesopotamia around 1500 BC. This was one of the first civilizations to develop writing, cuneiform to be exact. They'd press symbols into clay tablets with a stylus. And you'd think, with writing being such a revolutionary invention, they'd use it to document the rise and fall of kings' military strategies, farming records. Serious stuff, right? Well, one of the earliest surviving written records is actually a clay tablet that details a rumor. A messy one, too. Apparently, the mayor of a Mesopotamian city was having an affair with a married woman. And I just love imagining the ancient scribe rolling their eyes as they carved. This someone thought it was important enough to write it down forever. Literally etched in stone. I mean, imagine being an archaeologist, brushing away the dust, thinking you've uncovered a record of some epic political alliance, and then boom, ancient tea. And it didn't stop there. The ancient Egyptians were also heavy into gossip. Like surprisingly into it, they used hieroglyphics not just for spiritual or royal messaging, but to insinuate things. One famous example that researchers at the Rosicrucian Egyptian Museum uncovered was a set of carvings implying that a pharaoh was having secret late-night visits to one of his generals. The gossip was, let's say, heavily suggestive. It mentioned the king having no wives in the palace, and those late-night visits definitely weren't about battle plans. And again, this wasn't whispered behind palace walls. It was carved into stone. Like, that's some commitment to the drama. And you know what that tells me? Gossip wasn't just entertainment. It was communication. It was how people made sense of what they couldn't say out loud. Power, sex, betrayal. These weren't just juicy stories. They were signals, clues, sometimes warnings, and carving it into walls or tablets. That wasn't just because it was the only way to write. It meant people wanted these stories to last. Another example that sticks with me is from the temple of Queen Hatshepsut, who, by the way, was one of the most powerful women in Egyptian history. There were rumors, literal pictorial rumors, about her having a sexual relationship with one of her advisors. The drawings are explicit, like uncomfortably detailed. And where were they found? In the servants' quarters? Which makes sense, right, if anyone knew who was sneaking in and out of whose chambers it was the staff. That's how gossip works. The powerful think they're invisible, but someone is always watching and talking. And these stories, they weren't just recorded, they were believed, they shaped reputations. They told people who to trust, who to fear, and who was secretly breaking all the rules. Fast forward a bit, and you start to see gossip appearing in scrolls on papyrus, on walls of temples, in royal court records. Anywhere people were writing things down, someone was also slipping in a little drama on the side. You'd get lists of offerings to the gods, and then bam, a footnote about the priest having an affair with a merchant's wife. That part makes me laugh, honestly. Like even thousands of years ago, someone somewhere couldn't resist adding, "Oh, and by the way." But here's the bigger point. This wasn't random. Gossip served a purpose. It created a social hierarchy. It enforced unwritten rules. It made examples out of people. Whether you were a king or a commoner, once your name was in someone's mouth or in someone's chisel, you had officially lost control of your story. That's what makes gossip so powerful. It's not just that people talk, it's that the talking changes things. Even now we see it. A rumor goes viral online, and before the truth ever catches up, someone's career is in flames. But back then, there were no tweets to delete, no apologies to issue. If your scandal made it into stone or onto a scroll, it stayed there for centuries. So when we talk about gossip today like it's some shallow, meaningless thing, I don't know. I think it's deeper than that. It's human. It's messy. And it's always been a mirror of what we value, of what we judge, of what we fear. And in ancient times, that mirror, it was made of clay, ink, and stone. Next, we're going to move forward a few thousand years to meet the man who saw gossip not just as a social force, but as a business opportunity. A man who would literally sell secrets for a living and make a fortune doing it. You're going to want to hear about him. Chapter 3. When Gossip Hit the Presses. You ever think about how strange it is that something as personal as gossip became public entertainment, like we went from whispering behind someone's back to printing it and selling it on street corners? And you can pretty much thank or blame that shift on one thing: the printing press. In 1450, a German guy named Johannes Gutenberg changed the world forever. He didn't invent books or stories or even gossip. What he did was make it possible to copy and spread ideas fast. Suddenly, instead of one handwritten scroll that only a monk could read, you could have dozens, even hundreds of copies of something available to the masses. At first, the printing press was used for what you'd expect: religious texts, political documents, educational material. But as with anything new, people found other uses for it. And it didn't take long before someone realized, wait a minute, if we print gossip, people will buy it. Now, this didn't exactly take off right away. For a while, printed gossip kind of lurked in the background, sprinkled in between respectable content. But by the 1800s, things started to change. And like a lot of things in the history of scandal, it all started with a woman and a rumor. In 1886, a London newspaper published a story claiming that Lady Colin Campbell, a high society aristocrat, had run off with a man named Lord Blandford. Now, Lady Colin wasn't just anyone. She was a trendsetter, a fashion icon, a muse to playwrights like George Bernard Shaw. She once made headlines just for having her feet professionally manicured. That's how watched she was. So, when this rumor about her affair hit the papers, it caused chaos. Not because it was confirmed, because it wasn't, but because of what it implied. A lady of her status leaving her husband scandalous. Unheard of. And yet the gossip was so loud, she ended up filing for divorce anyway. That was a huge deal at the time. Jans. Divorce wasn't common, especially not for women of her social rank. Just the appearance of impropriety was enough to destroy a reputation. And that's kind of when people started to realize gossip could be weaponized in print. It could affect marriage's social status, even politics. From that point on, newspapers didn't just report the news, they began to blur the line between information and entertainment. And let's be honest, we're all guilty of eating it up. Because gossip in print, it wasn't just something you heard from a neighbor anymore. Now it had authority, it looked official. If it was in the paper, it had to be true. Right. But here's the thing that really sticks with me. Gossip didn't just reflect society, it shaped it. What people chose to print, and what readers chose to believe, started to create this unofficial rulebook. Like, what kind of behavior was acceptable? Who got away with what? Who didn't? There's a quote I love from journalist Elaine Louis. She did a TED Talk on the sociology of gossip, and she said gossip allows us to communicate a code of behavior together and set a standard of conduct. It reflects the morals and ethics of a culture at a given time. That really hit me, because when we look at gossip through that lens, we realize we're not just talking about messy drama, we're talking about social control. Gossip became a tool to enforce norms, to punish people who broke invisible rules. And often those people were women. Women who were too loud, too bold, too sexual. Women who stepped out of line. Women like Lady Colin. It's kind of disturbing when you think about it that a rumor alone could dictate whether someone was accepted or shunned. It didn't have to be true, it just had to sound true. It had to feel like something that fit the narrative people were ready to believe. And that's the dangerous thing about gossip in print. It spreads faster, lingers longer, and carries the illusion of truth. But the biggest shift was still to come. Because by the end of the 1800s, a man named William Dalton Mann would take everything the printing press made possible, mass distribution, sensational headlines, public obsession with status, and use it to build an empire of secrets. And money. Lots of it. He wasn't just printing rumors. He was selling silence. And he was about to turn gossip into a full-blown business model. Chapter 4. The Moral Code Behind the Rumors. You know, the more I think about it, the more I realize gossip isn't really about the people being talked about. It's about the people doing the talking. Because gossip at its core isn't just about curiosity or entertainment. It's about power. It's about deciding what's right and what's wrong without ever saying it directly. It's the court of public opinion whispered behind closed doors, scribbled in margins, shouted from headlines. And the sentence it delivers, social shame. And what's wild is most of us don't even realize we're part of it. We hear something scandalous, maybe raise an eyebrow, maybe share it with a friend, and boom, we've just reinforced a cultural rule. When Lady Colin Campbell was dragged through the papers in the 1880s, it wasn't just about her rumored affair. It was about what her alleged behavior represented. A woman stepping outside the boundaries of marriage. A woman choosing pleasure, independence, freedom. That was dangerous. So society punished her. Not through the courts, but through rumors. Through public humiliation, through gossip. It's subtle, but it's brutal. And it's been happening forever. In some ways, gossip is like a social survival tool. It's how we send signals to each other, what's acceptable, what's taboo. It's our way of saying, don't do what she did. Look what happened to her. And we pass these stories around like cautionary tales, even when we pretend we're just being entertained. But there's a darker side to that too. Because gossip almost always targets people who are already vulnerable, especially women, especially marginalized voices, and especially people who don't follow the script society wrote for them. In medieval Europe, women were literally punished for gossiping, not just scolded, punished. There was something called a scold's bridle, which was basically a metal muzzle locked onto a woman's head if she was considered too talkative or opinionated. Just imagine that for a second. You say too much, you speak too freely, and they silence you physically. And here's where it gets even more twisted. The very thing women were punished for talking. Expressing opinion, passing on information, is the same thing gossip columnists would later be praised for. But only once they figured out how to profit from it, and only once men got involved. So yeah, gossip isn't just about juicy secrets. It's about gatekeeping behavior. It's about public shaming, and often it's about controlling women. There's something else that's always stuck with me. That TED Talk I mentioned earlier from journalist Elaine Louis Shi said something that really made me pause. She said, "You can't consume gossip without bias." And she's right, because the reason a story becomes juicy in the first place is because someone in it is breaking the rules. Maybe they're having an affair, maybe they're getting a divorce, maybe they're just refusing to apologize for being who they are. And when we talk about them, we're not just repeating facts, we're passing judgment. Think about the stories that blow up online. 9 times out of 10, they're not about crimes or violence or danger. They're about people breaking cultural expectations. The celebrity mom who goes clubbing, the influencer who doesn't look grief-stricken enough, the politician with a secret relationship. Gossip thrives on moral panic, and it reflects exactly what we as a society are anxious about at that moment. One decade, it's premarital sex. The next, it's gender roles. The next, it's who's allowed to be famous. And here's where it gets really interesting. Even the people spreading the gossip, many of them believe they're doing a kind of public service. That's exactly what Colonel William Dalton Mann believed when he started publishing Town Topics in the late 1800s. In his mind, exposing people's scandals was a form of moral correction. He thought that by revealing bad behavior, he was teaching society a lesson. Of course, he was also making a ton of money while doing it. But that's the contradiction at the heart of gossip, right? It's always walked the line between judgment and entertainment, between righteousness and revenge. Sometimes it exposes injustice, other times it creates it. And that's why gossip can be so tricky to talk about. Because yes, it can bring powerful people down, but it can also ruin lives just because someone didn't like how you lived yours. So when people say gossip is harmless or silly or petty, I don't know. I think there's more to it. Gossip isn't light. Gossip is loud, it's heavy, and it lasts a long time. Just ask anyone who's ever had their name dragged through a rumor they couldn't shake. And in the next chapter, we're going to meet the man who took all of this, the morality, the scandal, the fear, and turned it into a product. He built an empire out of secrets. And trust me, he knew exactly how to use your sins against you. His name was William Dalton Mann, and he didn't just gossip, he threatened. Chapter 5. The Man Who Sold Secrets. You know, some people hustle for money, others hustle for fame. But then, there are people who hustle for control, and honestly, those are the ones you really need to watch out for. That's the kind of man William Dalton Mann was. Now, you probably haven't heard his name before. He's not in the average history textbook. But if you've ever read a gossip column, or scrolled through a blind item online, or felt that stomach drop after reading some scandal in the headlines, you've felt his legacy. Because William didn't just profit off gossip, he perfected it. So let me back up and tell you who he was. William was born in 1839 in Sandusky, Ohio, one of 13 kids, which, let's be honest, already sounds like a setup for a kid desperate to stand out. His early life is actually a bit of a mystery. Some historians called it shadowy and humble. I always laugh at that phrasing. Like, what does that even mean? Shadowy sounds like he crawled out of a fog bank in a top hat. Anyway, like a lot of ambitious young men at the time, William joined the army during the Civil War. He actually fought at the Battle of Gettysburg and was promoted to colonel, which is how he'd later style himself Colonel Mann. That title would follow him for the rest of his life, even when he had long since traded battlefields for boardrooms. After the war, he started inventing things. One of them was a kind of cargo rig for military equipment, which he licensed to the U.S. Army. That deal made him rich temporarily, but William was the kind of man who burned through money faster than he made it. By his 40s, he'd lost most of his wealth investing in luxury rail cars, specifically a company called the Man Boudoir Car Company. It sounded fancy, but it flopped. Hard. Still, William kept up the image. Expensive clothes, high society events, the whole performance. And that's when he figured something out, something most people never do. Perception is everything. If you look important, people will treat you like you are. If you act wealthy, they'll believe it. And if you have access to secrets, well, then you've got leverage. That's when he shifted from invention to manipulation. In 1885, William and his brother, Eugene, bought a struggling New York magazine called Town Topics. At the time, it was just a lifestyle publication, fashion, tips, party, announcements, maybe a recipe or two. Very tame, very proper. But William looked at it and saw potential. What if instead of just writing about society, he started exposing it? And so he created a weekly column called Saunterings. The title sounded harmless, like a leisurely stroll, but what he was doing wasn't harmless at all. In those pages, William spilled secrets. He printed hints, clues, and just enough detail to let his readers guess who he was talking about. Names were never mentioned, but everyone knew. He was describing the elite of New York politicians, bankers, actors, heiresses, and letting the public fill in the blanks. These were what we now call blind items. And they were brilliant, because legally he wasn't accusing anyone of anything directly, so you couldn't sue him for libel. But socially, he was destroying reputations every week. And here's where it gets darker. William didn't just print the gossip, he monetized it. He started sending people agents, really, to visit the wealthy individuals he planned to write about. They'd show up tip in hand and basically say, "We're about to run a story. But if you'd like it to go away, maybe you could buy some ad space in next week's issue." It was blackmail. Plain and simple. Legal loophole or not, it was extortion. And people paid. A lot. One man, William K. Vanderbilt, one of the richest men in America at the time, paid $225,000 to keep a story out of the magazine. That's not adjusted for inflation. That's in 1900s dollars. Today, that would be millions. Another man, Charles M. Schwab, paid $10,000. And a U.S. senator, he handed over $100,000 in stock to bury his scandal. And if you didn't pay, William would run the story. And sometimes even if you did pay, he'd run it anyway, just disguised as a glowing profile that was so overly complimentary, it made readers suspicious. Like, oh, he's being nice now. That guy must have something to hide. It was a lose-lose game, and William was winning. What blows my mind is how long he got away with it. Town Topics never got sued. Not once. Because William was smart enough to never cross that legal line. He danced right up to it and winked. And what's maybe even scarier is that society loved it. Readership skyrocketed. People couldn't wait to open the next issue and decode the clues. It was like a scandal-themed treasure hunt. But let's be clear, this wasn't just entertainment. This was about control. William had the power to end careers, tank marriages, shift public perception, all with a few sentences. And the wealthy knew it. They feared him. That's what made him so dangerous. He thought of himself as a moral force. He once said, "To save the sinner by rebuking the sin is an achievement over which the angels rejoice." But let's be honest. William wasn't trying to save anyone. He was selling salvation to the highest bidder. And while he was doing it, he laid the blueprint for every gossip column, every celebrity tabloid, every clickbait headline that came after. He made gossip a business, and business was booming. But what happens when you try to blackmail the wrong person? That's exactly what William did next, and it was a mistake he'd never recover from. Chapter 6. The Woman Who Fought Back. You know how every empire that rises on secrets eventually falls because of one. That's exactly what happened to William Dalton Mann. By the early 1900s, Mann was at the top of his game. Town Topics was thriving. He was respected or feared depending on who you asked. Politicians, celebrities, Wall Street men, They were all paying to keep their names out of his infamous saunterings column. He had money, influence, power. But what he didn't count on was Emily Post. Now, before she became the queen of American etiquette, the woman who literally wrote the book on how to behave, Emily was just a smart, sharp, and socially aware woman married to a man named Edwin Post. Edwin was a Wall Street stockbroker, successful, well-connected, and having an affair. Not exactly rare in high society back then, but still scandalous if it got out. Which, of course, it almost did. William Mann got wind of it, Edwin's affair with a Broadway actress and the apartment he was secretly paying for, and just like he always did, Mann sent one of his men to collect. The offer was simple, $500, or the story runs. Now, $500 might not sound like much today, but back in 1905 that was a small fortune. Equivalent to over $15,000 today, maybe more. And Edwin didn't have it. Whether he couldn't pay or just panicked, we'll never know. But instead of scrambling for the cash, he went home and told his wife everything. And here's where the story turns. Because Emily Post could have done what so many others did: beg pay, hide, disappear. But she didn't. She fought back. This is the part that still gives me chills. Emily, this poised upper-class woman with everything to lose, didn't just get angry, she got strategic. She contacted the district attorney and helped set up a sting operation. She basically turned her cheating husband's blackmail into a trap. And it worked. On July 11, 1905, Mann's agent walked into Edwin's Wall Street office, expecting a payoff, and walked out in handcuffs. For the first time, the man behind New York's most feared publication was being exposed. Now, here's the thing. William Mann himself didn't get charged for the blackmail. He was too smart for that. He never did the dirty work himself. But the scandal rattled him. And the public, they were stunned. The man who made a living off other people's secrets had become the center of a very public one, and Emily. She filed for divorce, not quietly, not shamefully, but powerfully, on her terms. She didn't let the gossip columnists define her. She reclaimed her own narrative, that moment when the gossip king got outplayed by a woman who on paper should have been his perfect victim. It flipped the whole dynamic. People started asking questions. They started seeing Mann not as a crusader of morality, but as a predator cloaked in newsprint. And even though town topics limped along for a while, after that, something had cracked. The fear he once inspired was now mixed with mockery. Respect turned to suspicion. Eventually, Mann was charged with perjury in a separate case. It wasn't nearly as juicy as his blackmail operation, but it was enough to damage what was left of his public image. His health declined, and by 1920, William Dalton Mann was dead. No more blind items. No more veiled threats. No more secret visits demanding hush money. But here's what stuck with me most about this whole thing. William Mann wasn't taken down by a competitor, or by a lawsuit, or even by someone more powerful than him. He was taken down by a woman who refused to be afraid. Emily Post didn't just protect herself, she exposed the entire system. He had built a system that ran on shame, silence, and fear. And what's wild is, after all, that she went on to become the nation's go-to expert on grace, manners, decency. She literally wrote Etiquette, the guidebook on how to behave. Meanwhile, Mann's name faded into a footnote, his legacy reduced to a cautionary tale. And honestly, that feels like the most poetic ending of all. Because for all his schemes and secrets, William Mann couldn't manipulate the one thing that matters most when it comes to reputation: who controls the story. Next, we're heading into the glitz and chaos of Hollywood's golden age, where gossip wasn't just printed in papers, but planted by studios, wielded by gossip queens, and used to make or break stars. And trust me, if you thought Mann was ruthless, wait until you meet Luella Parsons and Hedda Hopper. Chapter 7. The Queens of Gossip, Luella and Hedda. If William Dalton Mann turned gossip into a weapon, then Hollywood turned it into a strategy. The story doesn't end with Mann's downfall. In fact, in a way, it was just the beginning. Because not long after his empire collapsed, a brand new one began to rise, this time in Los Angeles, under the hot lights of the film industry. And in the middle of it all were two women, Luella Parsons and Hedda Hopper. Now, if you haven't heard of them, let me just say this. These women weren't just gossip columnists, they were kingmakers and sometimes executioners. Let's start with Luella. Luella Parsons got her start in journalism in the early 1900s, but it wasn't until she found herself in Chicago, and then later Hollywood, that she really stepped into her power. She realized something no one else had quite figured out. Yet, people didn't just want to read about the movies, they wanted to read about the people in them. The messy stuff. The real-life drama hiding behind the silver screen smiles. And Luella had a knack for getting close to the stars. She knew how to make herself seem like a friend, like she cared, but what she was really doing was collecting stories. And in a town built entirely on image that made her more powerful than most of the studio executives. Now here's the twist. Luella eventually caught the attention of William Randolph Hearst. Yes, that Hearst, the newspaper tycoon who built a media empire. And guess who his girlfriend was? Marion Davies, a rising Hollywood starlet. So, what does Luella do? She starts praising Marion like she's the second coming of cinema. Glowing reviews, flattering profiles, constant coverage. And just like that, she earned Hearst's loyalty and a permanent spot in his newspaper chain. By the 1930s, Luella's column was syndicated in over 400 newspapers. She had the ear of the studios, the actors, the fans. And more importantly, she had their fears. One bad word from Luella could destroy a film, or a career, or a marriage. But Luella wasn't the only one in town. Enter Hedda Hopper. Now Hedda was different. She wasn't a journalist by trade, she was actually an actress first. Kind of a glamorous side character in dozens of films, usually cast as the rich snob or overbearing mother. But once her acting career started to stall, Hedda found a new way to stay in the spotlight gossip. At first, Luella didn't see her as a threat. I mean, come on, an actress turned writer cute. But Hedda wasn't playing. She had sharp instincts, even sharper elbows, and she was relentless. She started writing her own column, Hedda Hopper's Hollywood, and it caught fire. Suddenly, Luella had competition, and not just any competition, public, personal, vicious competition. The two women began a cold war of sorts, trading scoops, stealing sources subtly, and sometimes not so subtly attacking each other in print. They became mirrors of Hollywood itself, glamorous, calculated, brutal beneath the surface. And the studios, oh, they loved it. You see, back then, the studios controlled everything. Contracts, press, image. If they wanted to sell a love story, they might leak a rumor that the stars were dating off screen. If they wanted to bury a scandal, they'd cut a deal with Luella or Hedda to soften the blow or bury it entirely. Gossip wasn't just tolerated in Hollywood, it was engineered. And Luella and Hedda were in on it, willing participants in the machine, sometimes protectors, sometimes enforcers, sometimes executioners. But what's really wild is how their feud wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. There's this story, one of my favorites, about an MGM dinner party where both women were invited. Luella walks in, sees Hedda already at the table, and turns right around and walks out. No words, just nope. And it didn't stop there. They undermined each other at every turn. If Luella landed an exclusive, Hedda would rush to print a better one. If Hedda broke a divorce story, Luella would dig up something juicier the next day. But here's the thing, they needed each other. As much as they hated to admit it, the feud kept them relevant. It made their columns more exciting. Their careers ironically depended on keeping the tension alive. Still, neither of them played nice. Luella once held an actress hostage, I kid you not, in her home, just to make sure no other reporter could break the story first. Hedda, on the other hand, famously outed actors, exposed affairs, and ruined careers over political grudges. They weren't just writing about gossip. They were deciding who got to stay famous, who got to work, who got to fall, and for decades they ruled. But as the studio system began to crumble in the 1950s and 60s, so did their influence. Stars started to have more control over their own image. Television changed how people consumed celebrity news. And slowly, the queens of gossip started to fade. Luella retired, Hedda followed. Their legacies, though, remained complicated, powerful, and unforgettable. They were women who played a man's game and played it harder. They clawed their way into the boys' club of journalism and then redefined what it meant to wield power in a world built on illusions. But just like William Mann before them, their stories raise the same question. What happens when gossip stops being a whisper and becomes the loudest voice in the room? And in the next chapter, we'll talk about what happened when Hollywood stopped needing columnists. And gossip started living in the headlines, the magazines, and eventually the comments section. Because gossip didn't die, it just went digital. Chapter 8. From Headlines to Homepages. By the time Luella Parsons and Hedda Hopper retired, gossip had already outgrown them. The studio system was breaking apart. Stars were no longer locked into ironclad contracts or fake relationships cooked up in boardrooms. And the public. We weren't just peeking through the curtain anymore, we were tearing it down. The 1960s and 70s ushered in something new, more raw, less polished, more dangerous. Because suddenly gossip wasn't just coming from the columnists, it was coming from everywhere. The tabloids were the first to really understand what was happening. The National Enquirer Star Globe, they realized that the public wasn't just interested in celebrities. We wanted to consume them. Not just the red carpet moments, but the breakdowns, the affairs, the DUIs, the caught without makeup shots at the grocery store. And they gave it to us. Front page, bold font, no mercy. You know what's wild? In the early days, the Enquirer actually used to run wholesome stories. Recipes, family updates, Elvis sightings. But by the 1980s, that had all changed. They were camping outside hospitals. They were paying janitors and nurses for information. They had photographers chasing limos at 60 miles per hour just to get a blurry shot through tinted glass. And people ate it up. Circulation soared. These tabloids weren't sitting in the back of the store anymore. They were front and center right next to the gum. There was this moment, a real turning point in the 90s, when celebrity gossip stopped being a side dish and became the main course. Suddenly, entire publications existed just to track the rise and fall of the rich and famous. It wasn't about the work anymore. It was about the personal lives. And let's be honest, it worked because it tapped into something human, something emotional. Gossip, even when it's cruel, feels intimate. We think we're learning the real story. We think we're being led into some secret room. But that intimacy, it's a trick. A very profitable one. One of the most infamous tabloid scandals in history happened in 1997. And I think you already know what I'm talking about. Princess Diana. She had spent her entire adult life being chased by photographers. Her relationships, her mental health, her parenting all dissected in headlines week after week. And on August 31st, 1997, her car crashed in a Paris tunnel while being followed by paparazzi. The public was outraged. But also, we were complicit. The magazines that bought those photos, they existed because we bought them, and that's when something shifted again. The cameras didn't go away, but they evolved. Because while tabloids had been built on chasing celebrities, the internet introduced a terrifying new possibility. What if we didn't have to chase anyone? What if the scandal just came to us? In the early 2000s, websites like TMZ, Perez Hilton, and Gawker exploded onto the scene. They weren't waiting for publicists or studio reps. They didn't care about carefully crafted narratives. They wanted chaos and speed and clicks, and suddenly gossip became real time. You didn't have to wait until next week's issue. You could see a celebrity arrested at 2 a.m., and by 6 a.m. the mugshot was viral. I still remember when Perez Hilton first started drawing crude doodles on celebrity photos, circling cellulite, making fun of outfits outing people publicly. It was mean, it was messy, and it was wildly popular. But here's the thing, while it felt new, it wasn't. Not really. We were still telling the same stories. Women being punished for their sexuality. People being shamed for gaining weight, losing control, being too loud, too proud, too human. We just changed the format from whispers in salons to comments on forums, from blind items to blurry paparazzi videos. But the judgment, the moral panic, the exploitation, that never went away. In fact, it got worse. Because now everyone had access to the gossip machine, not just columnists, not just photographers, but us, the readers, the fans, the strangers. We could share a photo, spread a rumor pile on with 1,000 others. All from behind a screen. And with that kind of reach, the consequences got bigger. Careers tanked over screenshots, relationships crumbled under speculation. Mental breakdowns were turned into memes. It wasn't just about gossip anymore. It was about spectacle, and the line between truth and rumor got blurrier than ever. In the next chapter, we'll look at what happens when gossip leaves Hollywood entirely, when it starts targeting regular people, families, teenagers, strangers who never asked for fame, but ended up living in a scandal that went viral overnight. Because in the digital age, everyone's fair game. Chapter 9. When gossip goes viral. Somewhere along the way, gossip stopped being about the famous, and it started coming for the rest of us. It's a strange thing to witness this shift. For decades, gossip was something distant. It happened to movie stars, to politicians, to royalty. It existed on red carpets and behind velvet ropes, and for a long time, we could consume it without feeling personally at risk. But then, the internet changed all of that. The digital age democratized everything, including shame. Now anyone with a phone could be a gossip columnist. Anyone with a camera could become paparazzi. And anyone with a mistake or even just a moment taken out of context could suddenly become the main character of the day. And we all know what that means now. It's one thing to be talked about in a tabloid. It's another to wake up and find your name trending on Twitter, or worse, your face splashed across Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, and YouTube, dissected by people who have never met you, don't know your life, and don't care about your side of the story. I think about Justine Sacco. Maybe you remember her, maybe you don't. But in 2013, she was just a PR executive flying from New York to South Africa. Right before boarding her flight, she posted a sarcastic, dark joke on Twitter, something about being white and not catching AIDS. It was meant to be irony, satire. Poorly worded, sure. But she had a small following, maybe a couple hundred people. By the time she landed, 11 hours later, her life was over. She was the #1 trending topic worldwide. Her tweet had been shared tens of thousands of times. There were hashtags calling for her to be fired. Strangers had tracked down her employer, her family, her travel itinerary. When she turned her phone back on, she wasn't a person anymore. She was a punchline, and the worst part, most people didn't even care what the tweet actually meant. They just saw an opportunity to dunk, to judge, to join the mob. That's what gossip has become in the digital era. It's not just whispers in the hallway, it's pile-ons, it's public shaming disguised as accountability. It's the sick thrill of watching someone crumble and convincing ourselves that we're righteous for participating. And it doesn't stop with adults. Teenagers' kids have taken their own lives over screenshots, private photos leaked without consent, rumors that snowball into full-blown harassment campaigns. Sometimes it's classmates, sometimes it's total strangers, but the damage is the same, permanent, devastating. I remember reading about Tyler Clementi, a college freshman in New Jersey. In 2010, his roommate secretly recorded him kissing another man and streamed it online. It wasn't framed as gossip exactly, but that's what it was, an invasion, a violation. A moment of intimacy twisted into a spectacle. Tyler died by suicide days later. And the thing is, the people who shared that video, who laughed, commented, passed it around, they probably didn't see themselves as cruel. That's the terrifying part. We don't think we're gossiping anymore. We think we're reacting, critiquing, having a conversation. But when thousands of people are doing it at once, turning a person into content, what's the difference? The line between gossip and abuse has never been thinner or blurrier. And yet, we still do it. Because gossip gives us something, a sense of control, a shared target, a temporary relief from our own mess. And the internet. It gives us a front row seat, an anonymous platform, and the illusion that we're not really responsible for what happens next. But let me tell you something I've learned doing this work. There is always someone on the other side of the screen. Someone reading the comments. Someone crying in a bathroom. Someone begging a friend to take it down. Someone whose life will never go back to the way it was. And that person could be anyone: a neighbor, a teacher, a nurse, your kid's classmate, your Uber driver, your coworker, or you. In the next chapter, we'll look at how some people are finally pushing back, reclaiming their stories, fighting back against online mobs, and asking the question we all need to sit with. What does it mean to be decent in a world that rewards cruelty? Chapter 10: Reclaiming the Narrative. I've spent a lot of time thinking about how gossip works, how it spreads, who it targets, and the damage it leaves behind. But what I've started to notice, especially in the last few years, is that something's changing. People are fighting back. Not just celebrities with PR teams and legal threats. I'm talking about regular people, the ones who used to be swallowed whole by a viral rumor, who used to disappear quietly when their lives exploded on the internet. Now they're reclaiming their stories. They're speaking up. They're saying, actually, this is what happened. And they're doing it on their own terms, in their own words, without waiting for permission. And I'll be honest, watching that shift has been one of the most hopeful things I've seen in a long time. Take the rise of counter-narrative videos on platforms like TikTok and YouTube. People who've been publicly dragged, accused, or misrepresented are now pulling back the curtain and saying, let me tell you what really went down. And it's not always polished, it's not always perfect, but it's real. It's human. Sometimes these stories confirm what people suspected. Sometimes they challenge everything. But either way, they remind us that there are always layers, that no one is just the villain or the victim or the headline. And there's something powerful about hearing someone say, this is how it felt. This is what you didn't see. This is the cost of your entertainment. I think about the woman who went viral just for looking annoyed during a celebrity interview. Strangers called her names, made memes, speculated about her personality, like she was a character on a reality show. But then she made a video, no makeup, no fancy lighting, and she said, I wasn't being rude. I was nervous. I had just lost someone. I wasn't ready to be on camera. And suddenly, all those comments that felt so justified, they didn't feel so harmless anymore. That's the thing about gossip. When it becomes a spectacle, it flattens people. It strips away their context, their pain, their complexity. And it makes us forget that real lives are playing out behind the scenes, but more and more we're seeing those lives step forward. We're seeing people sue for defamation and win. We're seeing schools and companies rethink how they respond to viral rumors. We're seeing movements that center empathy over exposure. We're seeing a whole generation of young people asking, is this really how we want to treat each other? And look, I know it's not perfect. Gossip isn't going anywhere. It's too old, too addictive, too profitable. But I also think we're learning. We're learning to pause before we hit share, to ask where that story came from, to wonder how we'd feel if the target were us or someone we loved. We're learning that being first isn't the same as being right, that being funny doesn't excuse being cruel, that calling something tea doesn't erase the fact that it might be someone else's trauma. And most of all, we're learning that we have a choice. Every time we read a headline, every time we click, every time we talk about someone else's life without knowing the whole story, we're making a choice. We can either feed the machine or we can question it. We can ask, what's the cost of this story and who's paying it? In the final chapter, I want to talk about what gossip means for all of us, not just as consumers, but as human beings. Because at the end of the day, gossip isn't just about scandal, it's about power and who we give it to. Chapter 11: The Cost of the Whisper. When I started digging into the history of gossip, from the velvet-draped parlors of the 1800s to the brutal glare of social media, I thought I was tracing a pattern of scandal. But what I found was a pattern of power. Gossip isn't just about who slept with who, it's about who gets to own the narrative, who we choose to believe, who we rush to punish, who we secretly root for to fall. And most of all, it's about us, what we consume, what we share, what we laugh at, what we ignore. Because for all the names and dates and headlines behind every scandal, there's a mirror. one that reflects our values, our biases, our appetite for drama, and sometimes our need to feel just a little bit better about ourselves by watching someone else fall apart. That's the truth no one wants to admit. Gossip feels good. It's fast, it's juicy. It gives us a sense of control in a world that often feels chaotic, but that feeling, it comes at a cost. Sometimes that cost is someone's reputation. Sometimes it's their job, their relationships, their mental health. Sometimes it's their life. And most of the time, the people doing the whispering never see the wreckage. That's the dangerous part, the distance. When we talk about someone online or pass along a story at a dinner party or retweet something without checking if it's true, we're rarely close enough to feel the impact. But just because we don't see it doesn't mean it isn't real. It is. I think about all the people we've talked about in this series: William Dalton Mann, Emily Post, Luella Parsons, Hedda Hopper, Tyler Clementi, Justine Sacco, Princess Diana. Some were powerful, some were victims, some were both. But all of them were shaped by the same force, that constant, relentless hum of speculation, of whispers, of judgment dressed up as entertainment. And it makes me wonder, what would happen if we got quieter, not silent, but more intentional? What would happen if we stopped treating people's lives like storylines? What would happen if we paused before forwarding that screenshot, before clicking on that headline, before turning someone's worst moment into a joke? What if we asked, who is this helping and who is it hurting? I'm not saying we should stop talking about truth or stop holding people accountable, but maybe we need to learn the difference between exposure and exploitation, between curiosity and cruelty. Because here's the thing, no gossip column ever prints. Every story has a human behind it, and sometimes the most radical thing we can do is remember that. Thank you for spending time with me, for listening, for questioning, for being open to seeing the quiet cost of the loudest voices. This has been True Crime Echoes, and if there's one echo I hope stays with you, it's this. We can't always stop the whisper, but we can choose not to carry it. If there's one thing I hope you take away from all of this, it's that gossip isn't just background noise. It's a force. One that has shaped careers, ended lives, built legacies, and exposed how easily we can turn strangers into stories, and stories into entertainment. But it also shows us something deeper about ourselves, what we value, what we fear, what we're willing to believe without proof. And maybe it gives us a chance to pause, to reflect, to ask better questions before we add to the noise. Because even though the internet moves fast and headlines blur into each other, real people still live behind the rumors, behind the shame, behind the clicks. Thank you for being here, for listening with an open heart. This is True Crime Echoes, and sometimes the most dangerous crime isn't the one in the news. It's the one hiding in plain sight behind a laugh, a headline, a whisper. Until next time, stay curious, stay kind.